Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. Don't check your schedules. Yes, we are on a Monday, which means that we're using the dreaded estimates. We're doing this on Monday for a couple of reasons. Number one, I have some travel that I'm doing today. Number two, the review embargo for the first couple episodes of Ahsoka, the new Star Wars show, drops tomorrow, right around the time when Charts would usually come out. So it was a good reason to do this show on a Monday, and there are also some numbers that probably aren't final, but we'll still work through them. We'll get the gist of what happened at the box office this weekend. Of course, the number one movie was Blue Beetle, which replaced Barbie. It ended Barbie's 4-week reign at the top of the box office, but it was a mixed performance at best for Blue Beetle. So let's just jump into this box office top 5. We see there Blue Beetle debuting on the lower end of expectations at $25.4 million. The only upside really is that it, well, I guess I would say only in comparison to a comic book movie, had a budget of around $100 million, and we'll look at it in context of the greater DC universe. As I mentioned, Barbie dropped down to number 2. It was competitive, though, for that number 1 spot. $21.5 million in week 5, a 36.5% drop from last weekend. Its domestic total is now at over $567 million. Much more to update about Barbie as well. Oppenheimer stays in third place. It drops 43.7% from last weekend, a $10.6 million total, and a domestic total of around $282.2 million. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem is at number 4. It drops 44.9% for an $8.4 million total and a domestic total of $88.1 million. It seems headed towards $100 million domestic. Strays was not really able to cash in at the box office. $8.3 million opening in 5th place. Comedy has had a tough run financially lately, and Strays is no different. In 6th place is Meg 2, The Trench. It drops 47.6% from last weekend for a $6.7 million weekend total. Its domestic total is now at $66.5 million. Talk to Me from A24 stays at number 7 with $3.1 million and a $37.3 million domestic total. We actually have some charts to look at for Talk to Me because it has quietly been putting together a pretty impressive summer movie resume. Haunted Mansion is in 8th place with 48.2%, just $3 million estimated for the weekend, and a domestic total at $58.8 million. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 stays at number 9 in its 6th week of release, a 40.8% drop, and a total of $164.6 million domestically. And then dropping like a stone is The Last Voyage of the Demeter. It almost went out of the top 10 this weekend. $2.5 million in its 2nd week of release, a 61.6% drop, and a domestic total at $11.3 million. Dropping out of the top 10 so far, I think, is Sound of Freedom after 6 weeks, and then Jailer after 1 week, although this might be the victim of having these estimated numbers. Sound of Freedom, the estimated number, is right on the border. It may actually overtake The Last Voyage of the Demeter. It could end up being the number 10 movie of the weekend at the box office if those estimates are different from the actuals. And then Jailer, which was a top 10 movie last week, I don't even have box office numbers for Jailer this weekend, so it's possible it stayed in the top 10. I just don't know how it performed. When people ask, well, why do you do the show on Tuesday? It's usually because actual numbers and final numbers and kind of straggler numbers for a lot of these movies don't even come in till Monday afternoon, sometimes later than that. That's why I wait so long usually to do this show, because I want to be as accurate as I can be. Looking at the movies that lost the most theaters this past weekend, for a 2nd week in a row, Haunted Mansion leads the pack. It lost 680 theaters. It's now playing in 2,180 theaters nationwide. Sound of Freedom beginning to lose more theaters. It dropped 651 theaters, but it's still in over 2,000 theaters nationwide. Talk to Me, impressive that it's still basically where it was last weekend at the box office, because it dropped 590 theaters. It still remains in 1,789 theaters. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning still getting rid of theaters at a pretty rapid pace. 527 theaters lost this weekend. It's now in just over 1,600 theaters nationwide. And Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem beginning to lose theaters. It lost 473, although it's still in 3,477. A new feature that I added to the show last week was a look at movies that are closing either this past weekend or will be closing this week. And this is a movie that we barely talked about, but is one of the biggest disappointments of the summer. It's the latest film from DreamWorks Animation, the lowest grossing film ever from DreamWorks Animation. Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, after 7 weeks in domestic release, will be closing after a $15.7 million domestic gross and international gross of around $25.8 million. That brings it up to a worldwide gross around $41.6 million. It still has a couple of markets remaining. I believe Australia later this year and then Japan next year. But look at my estimated theatrical loss for Ruby Gillman. Although keep in mind, this is global ticket sales only. This doesn't include things like streaming where it could definitely make some of this money back. But I estimate Ruby Gillman could lose up to $100.6 million theatrically. How do I come to that figure? Let's look at the breakdown. I didn't have time to do this last week because so many movies closed. It didn't play in China, so no money coming in from that market. $25.8 million internationally, a 40% share of that back to investors is $10.3 million. And then about $10 million coming back from the domestic marketplace week over week because it didn't do very well. It had a budget of around $70 million. I'm actually giving it perhaps a discount on its prints and advertising budget. I'm saying it only cost $50 million to market the film just because there didn't seem to be that much marketing. So I'm estimating costs on Ruby Gillman at $120 million. The gross income so far, $41.6 million worldwide. Out of that, I'm estimating a net of $19.3 million. And when you put that up against the $120 million cost, you have a shortfall of $100 million theatrically. So not great news for DreamWorks. Universal has done fairly well, at least not as bad as some other studios this year. But yeah, not exactly the performance I think they were hoping or expecting with this film. When we see how this weekend compared to both the average box office for 2021 and 2022 and the average weekend box office for the years 2015 to 2019, you can see that we are still well below the average for the 5 years preceding the pandemic, but well above the average for the past couple of years. The top performing film for 2015 through 2019 was the late summer opening of Straight Outta Compton. You can see that the box office average is about $150 million. We fell about $50 million short of that this weekend, although we are well above the average from where we've been since theaters started to reopen. The top performing film from the last couple years was Ryan Reynolds' Free Guy, which opened this time 2 years ago. No real change on the summer box office chart. Barbie is number 1 and will remain number 1, with Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse at number 2, Guardians Volume 3 at number 3, The Little Mermaid at number 4, and Oppenheimer at number 5. And really the question is there any movie that is going to rise up and displace Elemental as the 10th highest grossing film of the summer? I think there are only a couple of possibilities, unless there's another Sound of Freedom lurking out there somewhere. One of them is Gran Turismo. I don't know how well it's going to open. I don't know how well audiences are going to respond, but I guess it's always possible that movie could catch fire and get to $150 million domestically. And the other one may be The Equalizer 3, although that one is dumped on Labor Day weekend. September is not a traditionally high earning time at the box office. People are going back to school. People are going back to work. So I think it is somewhat of a long shot as far as replacing Elemental on this list. And it is very possible that these are our top 10 highest grossing movies of the summer, but I'm not ready to call the competition done just yet, because if this summer has proven anything, it's that we should be expecting the unexpected. Let's turn now to the international market. So these are all markets outside of the US and Canada. At number 1 is the Chinese film No More Bets, playing only in the Chinese market. It was also the top international and worldwide film last week. Oppenheimer jumps up to number 2 with $32 million. That's because it is still rolling out in some markets. It had a very strong performance in South Korea this past weekend. And Oppenheimer has not just been a strong performer domestically, it's also been a very strong international performer, and we'll see how it's doing on the worldwide charts in a little bit. Barbie is at number 3 with $26.7 million. Meg 2: The Trench adds another $21.9 million. And in 5th place is a Chinese film called Papa with $20.7 million total. Now, some people might be saying, well, Dan, where is Blue Beetle? Blue Beetle was actually not one of the 5 highest grossing international films this past weekend, and it's not because it didn't roll out in a whole lot of markets. It actually rolled out in all but a few of the major markets that it's going to hit. There just was little to no interest in the film anywhere outside of the United States and Canada, and quite frankly, not that much interest given the size of the film and the fact that it's a DC movie in the United States and Canada. I know that there was some hope that it might tie in, that people might kind of have a surge of enthusiasm toward the end for Blue Beetle, but the DC name alone is really not bringing people into theaters right now, especially after The Flash, and it doesn't seem like they were really able to mobilize a lot of people to show up for Blue Beetle either. When we take our domestic weekend gross, we combine them with the international grosses, we get the top 5 films worldwide. No More Bets dropped 34% from last weekend with its $58 million total. Barbie second in the world with $48.2 million. That's a 38.9% drop from last weekend. The domestic grosses for Blue Beetle get it up to third place worldwide at $43.4 million. Oppenheimer drops just 16% from last week. It almost took that third spot. It made $42.6 million worldwide. And Meg 2 The Trench, when you add in that domestic total, is at number 5. It drops 49.4% from last week for a $28.6 million total. So let's take a look at some of the movies in the top 5, and we will start with Blue Beetle. I know a lot of people have said, well, it's not in the DCEU. James Gunn says that he's going to be in the DC universe, the DCU, the new combined shared universe. That very well may be so, but we are still in an era where the DCEU has yet to wrap up. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom comes out later this year, so I'm going to compare Blue Beetle against other DCEU films. And when we look first of all at opening weekends, well, Blue Beetle is lucky that Wonder Woman 1984 had a pandemic-affected opening back in Christmas of 2020 when it premiered also on HBO Max. Very few theaters open, very few people going to theaters. That's the only thing that kept it out of the bottom spot, $25.4 million. It edges out Wonder Woman 1984 by about $9 million, and it comes in just below the Suicide Squad's opening in 2021 at $26.2 million, although keep in mind, it opened lower than a movie that was available day and date streaming on what was then called HBO Max, which is not great for Blue Beetle, especially because it opened right around the same time of year. Looking at the opening weekends adjusted for inflation, Blue Beetle stays exactly where it is if you don't adjust for inflation, 13th out of 14 films in the DCEU. These are really just baseline numbers, but when we look at the tracker for this franchise by domestic gross, it'll have to get to about $50 million to beat Wonder Woman 1984's gross. I think it'll do that. I think it'll outgross the Suicide Squad and Shazam! Fury of the Gods. Maybe, unless it really just completely falls off the map. But will it get up to Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous blah 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 of Harley Quinn? I don't know. Audience reaction wasn't that great, which we'll talk about. And I think that it's very unlikely to even sniff $100 million, which is where The Flash was earlier this summer. So not a breakout hit for this character. Looking at the franchise tracker by domestic gross adjusted for inflation, again, this just makes it even harder for Blue Beetle to move up this chart. And then looking at the franchise tracker for DC by worldwide gross, it's at $43.4 million right now. It basically has to do 3 times its opening weekend worldwide to beat Shazam! Fury of the Gods to not be the lowest grossing film in the DCEU, or I guess the DC universe. We'll see if it's able to do that, but it will certainly be near the bottom of all of these movies. So what happened with Blue Beetle? Well, number one, I don't think it helped that The Flash was so poorly received by a lot of audiences and that the movie wasn't a hit, because I think that it put the idea out there that DC films just aren't must-sees in theaters. It's hard to get people to go to a theater anyway right now, and when you have the idea that, well, this franchise is kind of then that's just another reason for people not to go. And one of the reasons why people might think that about DC films is because not many of them have actually been very well received by audiences. We talk about cinema score on this show a lot. It's not the end-all be-all, but it is a good indication of how well opening night audiences react to these movies based on expectation. And it does often kind of act as an indicator about how well these movies are going to do past opening weekend and what word of mouth is going to be. When we look at the cinema scores for the DCEU and now the DC universe, only 4 films landed even in the A range. No movie has ever scored an A+ in the DCEU or the DCU, Wonder Woman and Shazam are the only two films that got an A cinema score. Man of Steel and Aquaman, the only two films that got an A minus cinema score. And then look at that B plus column. A B plus cinema score generally means that audiences thought that your movie was good. It was fine, but it very rarely indicates that it's going to have phenomenal word of mouth and do great multiples of its opening weekend number. When you look at the movies that scored a B plus on Cinema Score, Suicide Squad, Justice League, Birds of Prey, Wonder Woman 1984, The Suicide Squad, Black Adam, Shazam! Fury of the Gods, and now Blue Beetle. A lot of people at DC and elsewhere had thought that Blue Beetle might be a breakout audience hit, but audiences generally went to see this movie and thought exactly the same of it as they have the majority of other films in the DCEU. I guess the only good news is that nothing in the franchise has fallen below a B score. The two lowest performing films were Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice and The Flash. Both of those movies got a B, although really when you think about it, those are also kind of the two most critical movies in the franchise because so many other things sort of revolved around the ramifications of those films. So DC picked two very inopportune times to have mediocre reviewed films from audiences. So overall for Warner Brothers, kind of a discouraging weekend with Blue Beetle's performance, but the continued performance of Barbie is something good for them to kind of be like, well, at least we have that. And I have to actually correct a pretty major error from last week here on the show. I was talking about all the records that Barbie was going to break, and I said that Barbie had become the highest grossing film worldwide in the entire history of the Warner Brothers studio. And according to my research, I was right. The problem was that my research was wrong. And I will quote a little sign that we have on our mantle here at our house, which was, "In my defense, I was left unsupervised. I do my absolute best to be as accurate as I can, but when I was compiling the data for this last week, I just completely overlooked Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 as far as the highest grossing films of all time worldwide for Warner Brothers and neglected to put it on the chart. So here now is the accurate chart of the highest grossing films of all time worldwide for Warner Brothers. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 is correctly listed here. It is currently the highest grossing film of all time in WB history. However, Barbie is soon going to surpass it anyway, so I have to correct the mistake, but it's going to be number one again. We'll just celebrate Barbie's ascension for a second time. It's kind of like New Year's Eve at those Disney bar places. It's New Year's Eve every night here on Charts. Barbie is now in second place with $1.279 billion, Aquaman in third with $1.143 billion, then The Dark Knight Rises in fourth place, and Joker in fifth place. Very grim movies. Aquaman, not entirely grim, but certainly 1, 4, and 5 very grim movies. Barbie, the only real beam of pink light in this lineup of films. One record that Barbie did definitively set this week, I promise, I did actually double check this, is that it did officially become the highest grossing film in Warner Brothers history domestically. It has now bypassed the domestic gross of The Dark Knight at $567.2 million. The Dark Knight now number 2 at $533.7 million. The Dark Knight Rises in third place, Wonder Woman in fourth place, and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 in fifth place. When you adjust this list for inflation, Barbie has actually moved past Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone to become the fourth highest grossing Warner Brothers film of all time domestic, adjusted, with The Dark Knight Rises at number 3, 1989's Batman at number 2, and The Dark Knight at number 1 with $757.7 million. Looking at the highest grossing films directed or co-directed by women worldwide, Barbie is getting very close, about $5 million away from passing the first Frozen film, which was co-directed by Jennifer Lee. And then the question is, can it make another 150 or so million dollars to bypass Frozen 2 to become the highest grossing film ever directed or co-directed by a woman in the history of the worldwide box office? It has already set that mark domestically, as we did accurately talk about last week. Looking at the race for what will be the highest grossing film of 2023 so far, and it's not really that much of a race anymore, Barbie will bypass the Super Mario Brothers movie probably today or tomorrow and become the top 2023 grosser. You see that Mario kept it close a little bit in the early goings, but Barbie has just opened up that lead. Currently through 31 days of release, it's at $567.1 million, over $60 million ahead of where Mario was at this point, and just cannot be caught right now for the top movie this year. Looking at Barbie versus other top grossers this decade, I explained this the first time I did the chart, but this is kind of the double-edged sword of this show. If I repeat myself from week to week, people say like, why do you keep saying the same thing every week? You don't have to repeat yourself. This is an example where I didn't do that and somebody said, you made a mistake, and it's because I chose not to repeat myself. When we're looking at this chart, and I say other top grossers in the 2020s, Spider-Man No Way Home is not on this chart, only because it makes the other data very difficult to read, because it's so far ahead of all the other lines that it just shrinks the rest of them down to the bottom of the chart. So this is with the acknowledgement that Spider-Man No Way Home is in its own league here as far as high-grossing films in the 2020s domestically. So looking at Barbie against the next four down on the list, you'll see that it is being caught by Avatar: The Way of Water. Basically, they are through 31 days tied. Barbie had a big lead, but we've talked about this with The Way of Water. It's just the longevity and those grosses week over week over week. So it doesn't look like Barbie will be able to beat Avatar: The Way of Water domestically. The question now is, will it beat Top Gun: Maverick? When you look at that green line, Maverick is now also beginning to close the gap. I'm guessing that Barbie's going to come in somewhere around 650, 675 domestically. We're kind of getting to the point where we can start making those grosses, although I have certainly underestimated Barbie before, and I may be doing so again right now. We've devoted a lot of time to talking about Barbie the last few weeks for good reason, but I also want to take a little time to talk about Oppenheimer and some of the marks that it has been setting, and it has also hit number one on a very interesting chart, which is the highest grossing films domestically to never hit number one at the box office. It is now officially number one in that category. It has outgrossed Sing, which was previously the highest grossing film to never hit number one. My Big Fat Greek Wedding is in third place, and then we have a pair of Alvin and the Chipmunks film, The Squeakquel at number 4, and the original Alvin and the Chipmunks at number 5. Also something I wanted to look at, the highest grossing films of all time with an R rating. We don't yet have a top 5 showing for Oppenheimer domestically, but it is now the 5th highest grossing R-rated film of all time worldwide. You see it there at number 5, $717.8 million. Very close to passing The Matrix Reloaded for 4th place. That one's at $741.8 million. And actually, if it can do about $60 million more in box office, it will pass both Deadpool and Deadpool 2, which did almost identical business between $782 and $785 million worldwide. I don't think that Oppenheimer's going to get to $1 billion, but it is going to be a clear number 2 behind Joker. And again, completely different from any of these movies, not based in any way on comic books or genre. This is a straight up 3-hour talky biopic about the guy who invented the atomic bomb, and yet it is doing incredible numbers worldwide. I never would have anticipated Oppenheimer doing this well. Another worldwide chart where Oppenheimer is making some noise, the highest grossing Christopher Nolan films worldwide. It has now bypassed the worldwide gross of Interstellar. It's number 4 at $717.8 million. It's got another $120 million or so if it wants to pass Inception on this list. I don't know if it's going to do that. A lot of how it does in the next few weeks in various markets will determine that. And then we have Nolan's $2 billion films, The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, at number 1 and number 2. But like I said, Oppenheimer, not just an impressive domestic performer, but great around the world as well. We have so many more charts to break down, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. This episode is brought to you by FirstLeaf. It is time to enjoy those last precious days of summer, and isn't it just the best? I know I love to take advantage of these last few weekends, have some friends over, cook on the grill, or just sit outside and enjoy the night air. And for all of these occasions, I want to make sure that I've got some great wine at the ready. That's why summer is still a great time to join the FirstLeaf Wine Club. To get started with FirstLeaf, all you have to do is answer some questions about your likes and dislikes on their website, and their expert team will select a customized assortment of great wines based on your preferences. We tend to enjoy some sweet wines to chill, maybe drink on a hot summer night, but it's also great to be able to select some great reds to have with a nice meal. Your personalized wine shipments are delivered right to your door, so you can sit back and enjoy bottles that you'll love for the rest of the summer, all priced lower than what you'd pay at a wine store. Plus, every selection is backed by FirstLeaf's 100% satisfaction guarantee. To make sure you've got great wine when you want it this summer, you gotta try FirstLeaf. Just head over to tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell to sign up, and you'll get your first 6 hand-curated bottles for just $44.95. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell. That's tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell to get your first 6 bottles for under $8 a bottle. Tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell. This episode is brought to you by AG1. AG1 is a daily foundational nutrition supplement that supports whole body health, and as the summer is winding down, that means it's never too early to keep your body and immune system in top shape as we approach the dreaded cold and flu season. I drink AG1 every morning, and it really makes me feel like I'm covering my bases every day. I travel, the channel keeps me busy, we've got the wedding stuff going on. It's important for me to keep things on track when it comes to my immune system, my gut health, and everything else. I've struggled in the past with keeping to a routine, let's be honest, most of us have, but drinking AG1 is as simple as, well, drinking a cup of water in the morning. AG1 is 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day, and that's it. Each scoop is packed with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. And I also have some single serving travel packs that I can just throw in a backpack, so I never have to miss a day of AG1, even when I'm on the go. With AG1, it's really just that simple. If you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/Dan. That's drinkag1.com/Dan to check it out. Let's take a few minutes to look at the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise as Mutant Mayhem stays in the top 5. It has now advanced to the 4th highest grossing film in franchise history. Domestically, it now trails only 2014's Ninja Turtles movie and 1990's original Ninja Turtles movie. It's at $88.1 million. It bypasses 2016's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows. When you adjust this list for inflation, though, it's down at number 6, although I think it still has a great shot of hitting that number 4 spot. It will imminently pass the adjusted gross of 1993's Ninja Turtles 3, and then I think by this time next week, it will bypass the adjusted gross of Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows and settle in right behind the adjusted grosses of 1990's Ninja Turtles, 2014's Ninja Turtles, and the 1991 sequel, Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze. So a top 4 finish upcoming domestically for Mutant Mayhem, and it's already in the top 4 worldwide, $118.4 million for the movie, behind the 2014 and 1990 versions, as well as 2016's Out of the Shadows, and that's probably where it's going to stay. I guess it could possibly get up to $200 million, depending on how it does in other markets, so it'll probably end up at number 4 or number 3 on this list. With all of these blockbuster movies that we've been talking about, the ones that did great, the ones that haven't been doing great, there's a very small film that has quietly been making some real noise, especially considering how much it costs to make, and that is Talk to Me. It's done really well. It's done over $30 million domestically, and it is now, and I was really surprised actually when I looked this up, domestically, the 5th highest grossing film in A24 history. When you look at their top 5, Talk to Me is now at number 5 with $37.3 million. It's about $7 million behind my beloved Hereditary, which is number 4 at $44 million. Then Lady Bird in 3rd place at $48.9 million. Uncut Gems in 2nd place at $50 million. And then the reigning Best Picture winner, Everything Everywhere All at Once, at $77.1 million. But it seems like those other 4 were so much more hyped than Talk to Me. And Talk to Me was certainly critically well regarded, but it does seem like it's been one of those movies that's just hanging around and that people are kind of loving quietly, largely because Barbie and Oppenheimer have kind of been getting all of the buzz. But good for you, Talk to Me, now one of the highest grossing films in A24 history. Looking at some weekend charts, let's look first at the per theater averages. Now, these are likely not the final numbers. A lot of times the smaller films come in on Mondays, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were 1 or 2 films that aren't listed here that actually had higher per theater averages, but we're just going with the numbers that we know right now, and that puts Blue Beetle on top with $6,562 per theater in each of its 3,871 theaters. Barbie is still in over 4,000 theaters and comes in 2nd place at $5,371 per theater. Returning to the chart is the Indian film. I thought I was going to get away with not having to butcher this pronunciation anymore. Rocky Aurani Ki Prem Kahani, making $4,081 per theater in 190 theaters. Oppenheimer comes in fourth place in just over 3,300 theaters with a $3,192 per theater average, and then Strays comes in fifth at $2,575 per theater in each of its over 3,200 theaters. Looking at the movies we know of right now in limited release, this would be 1,000 theaters or fewer, and it is dominated really by Indian cinema. Rocky Aurani is at number one, $775,000 in an unknown number of theaters, followed by Gadar 2 with $630,000, again in an unknown number of theaters, and OMG 2 with $556,000, again in an unknown number of theaters. The re-release of 2003's Park Chan-wook film Old Boy comes in fourth place at $495,000 in 250 theaters. And then the Ben Kingsley film Jules comes in fifth place at $221,000 in 645 theaters. Now, a lot of these specialty release films that we were just talking about can be found at the independent movie theaters that are spread around this country and around the world that are devoted to spreading a love, not just for studio movies, but for these independent films. And I've been featuring a different theater on the show for the past few months. 10% of the ad revenue from this show will go to the theaters that accept donations. And this week we're talking about the Sidewalk Cinema in Birmingham, Alabama, which is also the home of the Sidewalk Film Center. The Sidewalk Cinema's current location has been open since 2019 and features an intimate two-screen theater, which is programmed with popular library titles, as well as indie films, and the theater has a real community focus because the Sidewalk Cinema also has a large lobby and bar area that serves as a venue for community events like movie trivia nights. Hey, it sounds like my kind of deal. Also this week, it's a big week for the Sidewalk Film Center. They're hosting Birmingham's annual Sidewalk Film Festival, a week-long celebration of film featuring current indie hits and a selection of films from local talent. The festival's been a Birmingham staple since 1989 and has really gotten some buzz around the country. Sidewalk's mission is to encourage and facilitate filmmakers in Alabama and also grow the audience locally for independent film. I can tell you from experience that these organizations may be easy to find in LA or New York or even a big production hub like Austin, but they are few and far between, especially here in the South in places like Alabama and Arkansas. And so I really do appreciate what the Sidewalk Film Center is doing and what the Sidewalk Cinema is doing in Birmingham. It's a 501c3 organization, so any donation you make is tax deductible. If you want to find out more about the festival, the Sidewalk Film Center, or the Sidewalk Cinema, you can go to sidewalkfest.com. And as always, if you decide to donate or head over there to see a movie, tell them that Dan sent you. When we look at the domestic box office for 2023 so far, the Super Mario Bros. Movie enjoying its last day or two on top because you can see that Barbie is just $7 million behind it, so it will soon ascend to number one. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse stays at number three with Guardians of the Galaxy in fourth place and The Little Mermaid in fifth place. Oppenheimer, though, is looking for that fifth place spot very soon. It's at $285.2 million, ahead of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania in seventh place, John Wick Chapter 4 in eighth, Sound of Freedom in ninth, and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny in 10th place. The 2023 worldwide box office is also getting a few shakeups. The Super Mario Bros. Movie is number one at $1.357 million, but Barbie is now less than $100 million behind it. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is in third place at $845.4 million, and Fast X for now is in fourth place at $718.9 million, but it will imminently be passed by Oppenheimer, which is currently in fifth place, is going to be moving up to fourth place today. And who would have ever predicted that the Cillian Murphy-led 3-hour Christopher Nolan talkie historical drama would outgross worldwide Fast X, which was one of the best performing worldwide franchises of all time. I think it says a little bit about Fast X and it says a lot about Oppenheimer that we now live in that scenario. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse drops down to number 6, Full River Red drops down to number 7, and then The Wandering Earth 2, The Little Mermaid, and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 round out the top 10. Before we take a look at some movies that are in theaters and hitting theaters soon, as always, I like to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we're going back to the 33rd weekend of the year in 1988, August 12th through the 14th, which saw the debut of a Western called Young Guns. It debuted to just over $7 million. It had a final domestic total of $45.6 million. I mean, look at that lineup. Emilio Estevez, Kiefer Sutherland, Lou Diamond Phillips, Charlie Sheen, Dermot Mulroney, and of course, Casey Zamasco, the young gun that everybody remembers right away. In second place, Tom Cruise was in the top 5 then too with Cocktail. It dropped 24.1% in its third week with a $6.2 million gross. That movie had a final domestic gross of $78.2 million and also one of the best taglines for any movie ever. In the movie Cocktail, Tom Cruise plays a bartender and the tagline for the movie was, "When he pours, he reigns." R-E-I-G-N-S. Mwah. No notes. In third place was a little movie called Die Hard. In its 5th week of release, it improved 0.08%. It did almost exactly the same amount of business in week 5 that it did in week 4. It ended up with $83 million domestically as the final total. That's right, Cocktail and Die Hard were almost equivalent as far as box office performance. That just goes to show you how legacy can work in favor of a film. A Fish Called Wanda in its 5th week was adding business at 9.5%. It had a final domestic total of $62.4 million. And then a movie that played all through the summer, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. In its 8th week, a 26.2% drop from the previous week and a $4.3 million weekend total. Its final domestic total ended up around $156.4 million, but we don't just like to look at yesteryear and wonder what that money would look like in today's dollars. We hit that inflation button to actually see, and when we look at the inflation adjusted totals for this weekend in 1988, it shows us that adjusted to today's money, Young Guns would have opened to $18.1 million on its way to a $117.9 million final total. Cocktail would have been in second place at just over $16 million. And yes, a final domestic total of $202.1 million. That was a big movie back in 1988. Die Hard in its 5th week, a weekend total of $14.8 million adjusted on its way to an adjusted domestic final of $214.4 million. A Fish Called Wanda at $13.5 million adjusted and a domestic adjusted total of $161.4 million. And then Who Framed Roger Rabbit bringing in $11.2 million and a final adjusted domestic total of $404.2 million. That was a massive hit. Also a groundbreaking technical film. If you haven't seen, by the way, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it is one of my favorite movies of all time. And I think even still, 35 years later, one of the most impressive technical achievements in the history of movies. It totally holds up. Go see Who Framed Roger Rabbit. If you haven't seen it, it's on Disney Plus, I'm sure. It's so good. Before we look at some of the movies that are hitting theaters this weekend, I also want to look at some of the reviews of recent releases and some upcoming releases. It's something we've been doing the last few weeks. I call it Rotten Tomatoes Decoded, basically because the tomato meter, that number you see, the fresh rotten rating, only tells you whether critics liked a movie or didn't like it. It doesn't tell you how much they liked or didn't like a movie. It can be a little bit deceiving, and there's a couple of good cases when we look at this week's movies. Back on the Strip is a movie that opened in over 1,000 theaters but didn't really merit much mention because it didn't do that great at the box office, and it didn't do that great with critics either. Just a 27% on the tomato meter. You see Meg 2: The Trench also hanging around there near the bottom at 28%. Then right in the middle, kind of in the 50-ish% range, The Last Voyage of the Demeter, Strays, and Gran Turismo. Gran Turismo has gone back down to rotten since last week when it was fresh at 60%. Blue Beetle's at 76%, so marginally better than the other films. And then kind of clustered at the top, Barbie at 88%, Oppenheimer at 93% fresh. But above Oppenheimer, you have Talk to Me, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, Bottoms, and then the new Adam Sandler produced film, You Are So Not Invited to My Bat Mitzvah, which with just a handful of reviews right now is at 100% on the tomato meter. But this is a great example of how the fresh rotten metric doesn't always tell you how much critics like these movies. Let's look at this by critics' average rating. So this is a score they give a movie from 1 through 10, and it tells you how much they like each of these movies. Meg 2 is actually on the bottom. It got a 4.5 average rating. Back on the Strip is at 5. Strays, Gran Turismo, The Last Voyage of the Demeter, all right around the same when it comes to critical consensus, about a 5.5 or so. But look at the Adam Sandler film, You're So Not Invited to My Bat Mitzvah. 100% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, but an average rating of 6.0, which is just barely on the cusp of fresh and rotten. So what does this tell you? Well, I think it tells you when more reviews come in for this movie, there are going to be a fairly hefty number of negative ones, so it's unlikely that this movie is going to stay at or near 100%. And it also tells you that even the critics so far that have liked this movie didn't really love it. They just barely liked it enough to give it a recommendation. That doesn't show when you just look at the tomato meter, but it does show when you look at average ratings. So a very kind of mediocre performance, much closer to Gran Turismo and Last Voyage of the Demeter than Oppenheimer or Barbie for that film. Blue Beetle got a 6.4 average rating. That's fine. And then you kind of have the top tier. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Mutant Mayhem, and Talk to Me and Barbie are all kind of clustered together. And then really the top two films that critics are rating, Bottoms, which still doesn't have a lot of reviews. It has an 8.4 average critics rating and a 97% fresh. But right now, by average rating, Oppenheimer still your best bet as far as critical consensus. 8.6 average rating and a 93% fresh. And let's look at some of the movies that will be hitting theaters this weekend to compete with the films on this chart, although one of them is already on the chart, which is Gran Turismo, or Gran Turismo Based on a True Story, which I guess is now the new name for the film. It was supposed to hit theaters a couple weeks ago. They pushed the release date to August 25th. Well, that's this week after a couple of weeks of preview screenings, so we'll see how that does box office-wise. Jurassic Park is getting a 30th anniversary re-release in Real D 3D. I love Jurassic Park, and I've never actually seen it in 3D, so I might be checking this out this weekend. Bottoms, which is the film from Emma Seligman, the story of a high school fight club that two girls start in order to pick up their classmates. Again, a small number of reviews right now. It opens in limited release this upcoming weekend, so we'll see if those strong reviews keep coming in. Also opening this weekend is The Hill, based on the true story of baseball player Ricky Hill, starring Dennis Quaid. Golda is a movie that has stirred up a lot of controversy with the casting of Helen Mirren in heavy makeup as Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, so we'll see how that movie is received. Not great by critics thus far. Retribution, which is the latest film starring Liam Neeson that you'll probably buy your dad on DVD, is opening in theaters, some theaters, this weekend, along with an interesting looking movie called The Dive. It's a story about two divers that are trapped underwater with their air running out. That could be great, could be not so great, but it sounds interesting. Also debuting this weekend is a film called Scrapper. This is a movie that I saw virtually at Sundance. It's a really cute, very small film about a girl reconnecting with her father. It's from writer-director Charlotte Regan. It stars Harris Dickinson. This is the kind of movie that would be very easy to overlook, but it should not be overlooked. It won the World Cinema Dramatic Grand Jury Prize at Sundance, and I really enjoyed this movie. Is it going to be one of my top 10 of the year? I don't really know, but it's just a really great character piece between this daughter and her father and a lot of the complications about their lives and the tragedies, etc. If Scrapper is playing near you, or more likely if you see it on VOD in the next weeks or months, give it a shot because it is worth your time. And that does it for Charts with Dan for this week. I will be back tomorrow with my review of the first 2 episodes of Ahsoka, and then of course I'll be back later this week with more movie news reviews, box office, and all of that stuff. Of course, as always, please check the description for more about our sponsors, as well as a link to the Entertainment Community Fund, which helps to provide assistance to crew members who are out of work due to the strike, not just the writers and the actors, but also the people that build the sets and compose the music and do makeup and all of the other people that aren't able to work right now. It's a great cause to support. I know that they would appreciate it, as I appreciate you spending part of your day here with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.